One of the comments that's often made about agent-based models or social simulation models is that somehow these are sort of toy models, not really to be taken seriously. Now, as an economist, I can say, this charge does not hold. And if we look at, say, I'm not going to be talking about this for very long, but if we look at, say, the models of economics, now, okay, there's lots of calculus in them, and they look quite formidable, but these are incredibly simple. And so in a sense, these are toy models. So the dominant, just as to make a point, the dominant paradigm in macroeconomic theory in the last 20 to 30 years, the really influential one, if you wanted to get a paper in a top journal on macroeconomics, you had to use something called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. Now the maths gets quite hairy, but they try to represent the behavior of the entire economy with a single agent, a single representative agent. Now we think, why did these fail in the crisis? Well, there are many reasons, one of which because they're no good, but leaving that aside. Because in a financial crisis, debtors and creditors may act differently. So you need at least two agents, but that wasn't the case. So they are toy models, if ever they were. So I don't think this is a legitimate criticism, because I've probably come across this more than you, dealing with economists, and they'll say, these are not proper models because they're used to analytical solutions. We said, no, these are serious models, and I want to give some examples today of ABMs that people have paid money for. And what I'd like to do is to give some brief overviews and descriptions of around half a dozen of them, to draw out a few points which I think are general about when you're actually building practical models, and then to go into a bit more detail about one of the models that we built, and to draw out the points where, if in a sense, the client was interested and where they left it to us to decide. So that's really the outline. So here's some ABM clients. So we've done work. We've done several models, not on the banking side, but on the consumer side for the Financial Services Authority. Now, one of them was very simple, very simple. A few years ago, they had a policy, they may still have, I'm not sure, in their jargon. It was called depolarization, which is absolutely meaningless, but what it actually meant in English was that they were wanting to encourage, bring in regulation to encourage financial companies to offer a wider range of products. If you like, to prevent people just restricting it to their own. Barclays Bank could only offer Barclays. No, they had to offer a wider range. Because, of course, economic theory suggests that the wider the choice which is available, the more consumer welfare increases. Because obviously it's assumed that agents have got fixed tastes and preferences, and the more products are available, the more likely it is, or the closer every single agent can match his or her preferences to the range of products that's available. So it was thought to be unequivocally a good thing. But we just set up a very simple model. Consumers have got utility functions, but just added things from behavioral economics. It was a very simple agent model. So, for example, we incorporate the idea that gathering information has a cost. That the more evaluating a product carries a cost. We made some simple assumptions about, reasonable assumptions about how costs increase as you try to evaluate more alternatives. And so, okay, let's add some costs of gathering information. Especially with financial services, even at its most basic, many people have difficulty in understanding the nature of a product. Leaving aside the inherent problems, it's well known that many people have difficulty with concepts of even like percent, or certainly with fractions. I mean, basic concepts people have difficulty understanding. So what is the rate of interest on a mortgage? Many people are not clear what this actually involves. So introduce, say, imperfect information, imperfect perception of information that's available. Let's add that to when we increase the number of choices. And so the cost rises as we introduce more products. The imperfect information is the same around all products. But other factors such as, for example, it's well documented with big decisions, that people often suffer from something called regret aversion, that not everybody does, but you say you take a decision and then you spend a lot of time worrying and think, well, because if there's lots of choices available, you then worry that you've not made the right choice. And that itself imposes welfare costs. And so we just did a very simple exercise. Okay, let's start off with agents with utility functions and just have one product, and let's compute. We made some assumptions. What's the total? We actually added. We did what we shouldn't do. We added up the individual utilities and said this is a sum of utility, and then add more products. So at one level, as we add more products, then agents are able to get closer matches, so they gain utility, but at the same time, they're incurring costs. They may perceive things imperfectly, incur costs through that. They suffer from factors such as regret aversion. And under quite a broad range of assumptions about these different factors, we could show that quite rapidly, the benefits of choice in these areas tailed off, not just tailed off, but began to fall. Depending on the assumptions we made, it might fall after 6 or 7 products, or sometimes as many as 15. But certainly the idea that you could increase, the idea of increasing choice without limit was a good one. We could show quite simply that wasn't the case. I mean, using the insights of behavioural economics itself. So that was a very simple agent-based model. It really it wasn't much more, well, it was slightly more, than an Excel spreadsheet. But formalising these concepts was actually very helpful for people in terms of saying, well, what is the impact? We know these things exist. Let's make a reasonable range of assumptions about their impact, what actually comes out of it. And that was a very simple one. The health I'm going to talk about this in more detail when we did the Department of Health. But what we did was for South West Regional Health Authority. Now they have, which that's in the southwest of the UK. For people who are not British, Britain sort of sticks out into the Atlantic at the bottom, and that's a big area there, and that's the southwest. And there are several, but there are 2 big hospitals in one part of that region. It's a big geographic region. And one of them is quite geographically isolated, and they're big. And this is for non-emergency cases, for the general throughput of hospitals. And they wanted to know whether the more geographically isolated one was going to be viable over a 5-10 year period. Would they get enough throughput? They needed quite a lot, something like 50,000 people a year to keep it viable as its status, offering the full range. And of course they can do forecasts on this. They can do their own forecasts. They can do all sorts of time series analysis. And just perhaps trying to relate it to the state of the economy, the standard stuff. So you can do projections on this, which were essentially deterministic. So we looked at this and said, well, what we have is one of the key features. We discuss it with them. This is, again, a feature of these models. You discuss it with the client because they've got very specific knowledge. And they said one of the key features is that the doctors who make the recommendations which hospitals to send people to do communicate with each other and talk about the experience of their patients and whether it's gone well at particular hospitals. We know this goes on. And so we just had a very simple survey, and we, on the basis of this, were able to, if you like, approximate the network of communication across at least the mathematical features of the communication across the doctors across the region. And then we have for each individual doctor's surgery the proportion of patients that they sent in general to each of these 2 hospitals. So if you're very close, in general they'd recommend almost 100% go, but in the middle, so there are varying percentages. So that's the baseline. And we say, okay, what happens if let's say one surgery which has been sending, let's say 60-40, what happens if that reduces it for some reason, had a better experience, cuts it down a bit, and it's within a standard network analysis with a probability of that behaviour spreading to its immediate neighbours. So it's nothing more than a simple cascade model when agents are assigned thresholds of persuadability, the ones which are immediately connected to. And then we say we postulate that one agent changes its behaviour. How far does that cascade spread across the network. So it was a very familiar, very basic model, but it's calibrated to say we approximate the mathematical structure through a simple survey of essentially, who talks to who on a fairly regular basis. And that was the basis of the model. And then we say, okay, let's do a number of scenarios, let's project this forward, and can we see how frequently the large hospital was at risk? Because on a central forecast, if you just simply project numbers over time, it seemed fine. It seemed to be above its level of viability. But we could show that, obviously, when you're doing any sort of cascade model like this, when recommendations or ideas are cascading across a network of agents, we can get a wide variety of outcomes. But we could show that it didn't take a lot. It didn't take a lot of adverse recommendations from about the geographically isolated hospital. And there were reasons why they worried about this, because the one which was easier to get to, much more rapid access to London, for example, was able to attract better consultants, or it attracted better staff simply because it was more accessible. Even though it's in quite a geographically isolated part of Britain, you could get into London much more easily. And they worried that this one would get some adverse recommendations. And we could show you it didn't take a lot to actually sometimes produce quite dramatic results. So instead of projections around 50,000 patients a year, you could rapidly get scenarios easily get scenarios over a 10-year period when it went to 20,000. If you got a particular adverse cascade. Without a great deal, it didn't require, as we know from these cascade models, it doesn't necessarily require a major change of behavior of an individual agent. If this happens to cascade across most of the network, then that accumulates, that itself brings a big cascade. So it's useful for them because it made them realize they had decisions to make about whether to upgrade this, whether to make some major investment decisions. And they think, well, yes, if it was going to be viable, then they could spend the money elsewhere. But if they thought there was a risk, a possible serious risk of it falling below the level of viability, then they would have to invest in that hospital. So this wasn't the only thing they looked at, obviously. But it was one of the inputs in a very simple model based upon the idea of cascading agents, ideas of behavior cascading across a network of agents. And the addition we made was just a simple approximation to what we believe would be is a sort of structure in which the relevant agents here, the doctors communicating to each other, what that structure was. British Telecom, this is a few years ago, which they used in their discussions with the regulator. And this was a model of their landline phones, where this is going back to the mid-late 1980s. British Telecom for many years had been a nationalised industry and then was privatised. But this has been the experience of telecom companies now across the world. So many examples of privatisation. And what we typically find as an outcome of this is that the original monopolist, the original publicly owned company, retains a large market share of the order of 60–70% typically in Spain, Britain, aspects of America. This is in a landline market. And of course, from a regulator's point of view, from standard economic theory, that's a bad thing. It must in some way be anti-competitive. And yet, and I can assure people having experience, and Nigel will have the same experience of British Telecom when it was nationalised. This was, even just using the landline system in general, it is now far better. It's incomparably better from a consumer point of view in the UK than it was 25 years ago. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Prices in real terms are lower than they will be, and the quality of the service is much better. Despite the fact, partly due to competition from mobiles, etc., we know that, but let's just think about the landline market. And partly because it's a companies which could enter the market. And so we could think of the same model, the same approach with, say, the domestic electricity supply, domestic gas supply in the UK. And we built a very simple model where we have initial monopolists, we have a network of consumers. The monopolist supplies at a particular, in fact, the highest price which is feasible and the worst quality. We just start off with that. And then agents can enter according to a simple rule, depending, we thought, how much profit they think they can make. And they make a price quality offer. But a key feature of the model is to say when a new agent enters, not all consumers will be aware of its existence. Now, economists have great difficulty with this. I remember giving this paper a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, to a room of economists, and said, no, people would find out. How could people would learn? So all people would be aware of all companies. So I just offered then on a bet, if anybody in the room could name not the tariffs, how many companies were involved in supplying, say, domestic electricity on a retail basis, and nobody could. And then they all said, oh, well, because it's not worth our while. So fine, okay, right, But, I think I've made my point that, people just are not necessarily aware, even of all the suppliers in a market. And so people get access only to a certain number of consumers. And so, so we set this model up, and we have a simple rule for people judging whether they can make profits by entering. And we run it for a certain number of periods. And then we obviously there's a stochastic component to this, and we look at the results. And in general, there are rules how people can respond, in terms of price and quality, and rules for when consumers switch. But even building in a lot of inertia into consumer behaviour, which we know exists, I've always had these, I can't be bothered, it's an important feature. We find that in general we get exactly the result. We get not just that the monopolist in general, there's a wide range of outcomes, retains a large market share, but we get a highly competitive outcome from the point of view of the consumers. But we also look at other factors of the model, and we find that in general we know quite a lot about the evolution of industries. Most new entrants occur in the early phases when it's opened up, and then new entrants subsequently are relatively small, and most of these new entrants fail. So we've actually got the properties we know more generally about when industries are opened up to competition. And British Telecom were interested in using this, obviously, in discussing with the regulator. It was part of a huge document, a huge document. So it's just one part of their argument saying, look, the mere fact that we have 65% market share doesn't mean that this industry is anti-competitive. So it's just, if you like, an alternative model they could use in their arguments with the regulator. An interesting model we built for Svenska Handelsbanken, which is Sweden's largest bank. Now, not many people realise, but in the early 90s, Sweden and Finland had a massive financial crisis, much worse for them than the 1930s, for a variety of reasons. It was confined to those two countries. And the banks experienced, as you might imagine, huge losses on their corporate loans. But Svenska Handelsbanken had much big losses, but much less on the corporate loans and their much lower defaults than their competitors. Now, they had a different structure, different system of granting and monitoring corporate loans than was standard in the industry. They didn't operate a pure tick box regulatory approach, the sort that regulators are like. Here's a list of questions, and we tick all these boxes, and if they're all ticked, grant the loan. And the regulator was under pressure saying it's got to be more centralised like everybody else has got, not just the Swedish banks, but all the big international banks. But incredibly, this bank gave discretion to the branch officer to actually grant the loan. There was a rule book, but they just classified companies into one of 5 groups. And if you were in number 1, which meant you were really good, yes, then you got the loan. If you're number 5, you couldn't give it to them. But in 2, 3 or 4, the branch officer had discretion as to where to grant the loan. And there were various rules about how you monitored it over time. Now, it wasn't just the fact that the individual officer right on the ground had the authority to do this. And there were rules about referring up different sizes of loans, but ultimately it was their decision. There was also, importantly, and the bank knew this, an informal network across the branches of exchanging information about different, say, sectors of the economy, different firms which might operate in the same firm might operate in different parts of Sweden, or even in some cases individuals, who had had a loan when they'd applied for a loan, they had a loan from the bank in one part of Sweden, then they'd moved jobs and they were now applying for another loan. So as an informal network, which we were able to approximate the structure by a survey which the bank organised to try to approximate this about the exchange of information. And so the bank was interested in to say, well, were our low loans, were we simply lucky in the early 90s? Was it just by chance? Because as it happens, they didn't have a lot of loans out to companies involved in the European property market, which was where other banks lost huge amounts of money. Without going into the details, that was a proximate cause for that, and the main reason for their losses, I mean, they're huge. And they hadn't been strongly represented in that sector. And so the question was that just good luck, or was it due to their different system, because they're under pressure from the regulator to change their system of operation in terms of granting and monitoring loans, for one which is much more regulatory, rule-based, rather than allowing discretion. And so we had a number of discussions. We built this network in and built the system. And as it happens, we presented the findings to the board in July 2008. And we said, well, actually, we think it's your system, which was quite interesting because we were discussing at the board level on this instance, and there were divisions in the board. You know, some people were convinced it was, but some people were saying, well, you know, I think we were just lucky. I mean, division was reflected within the bank itself. So we said, okay, it's the system. Then actually, we then had a genuine scientific test of the model, because of course in September 2008 was the major financial crisis broke, just 2 months later. And of course, I mean, Sweden, like everybody else, experienced a very substantial recession. Corporate loan defaults rose very sharply across all banks, but not for Svenska Handelsbanken. They rose, but not as much. Now, it's not the model was just capturing their system, but this was actually very valuable for them in terms of their discussion with the regulator. And I actually think, as it happens, I think this particular, I've talked to people about this because I think this particular example could be copied much more widely. There might be a much better way, with all the discussion, how do we avoid financial crises? This might be a better corporate structure rather than the rule-based one, which seems to operate on the basis that we can anticipate any possible event and design a rule for it, and if you follow these, it will be fine. And we see the limitations of that approach. Advertising Association, done some work for a couple of projects for them, one of which on binge drinking, in other words, extremely heavy drinking by young people, which is a social problem in British cities. I gave a paper on this at ESSA a couple of years ago, which is published in Mind and Society subsequently. When I mean heavy drink, I mean like, you know, a litre of vodka will start the evening off. It's not just a few pints. I mean, this is really serious drinking. Now, obviously, there's a big issue about, the general issues about, alcohol regulation, control, and self-advertising. And we can see why the Advertising Association are interested. But, we do a scientific study on these things. And we just simply ask the question, because there's a huge literature on this, and also on child obesity, which we did a study for. But there's very little mention in the whole of the literature on either addiction through alcohol or obesity of social influence, of peer pressure or peer acceptance of behaviour. There's not much mention of this. There's all sorts of reasons given, say, for extreme alcohol consumption, but not very much in terms of influence across social networks. And we just simply asked the question in both cases, could we actually account for what had happened in Britain with agent-based models, which purely by deliberate construction simply relied upon peer pressure, peer acceptance, imitation across a social network? And the answer was, I won't go into the details, the alcohol papers published in Mind and Society, some really quite rigorous testing of the model shows that yes. It doesn't mean that's true, but it says if in the literature, if you haven't taken account of the idea that it may just simply be a fashion, just simply a fashionable phase to drink heavily, if you don't take account of that, then any policies you design to combat it are not likely to be terribly successful. You have to understand that to think about what the policies might be. And we just briefly finished in the middle of one for a group of water companies who are also involved in discussion with their regulator. But there's an issue. The regulator was also involved because it was interesting. The regulator here, I'll just mention this briefly, is full of economists who think, yes, if we set these incentives, I'm not making this up, then the companies will respond optimally. And of course, they're terribly puzzled because the companies almost never respond at all. And so we've got some, explaining why this is, it's actually quite straightforward, but we're in the middle of doing that. So, so there's some examples. So it's quite a wide range of things, which we've covered. So why do people want them? Well, this is an obvious point, but let's not, they want them to answer specific questions. They're not doing it as a research exercise. They have a specific problem that they want answering, or they want some help to deal with a particular issue. And that's very important. It's obvious, but we must never forget that. So they might be wondering, why has our market or company evolved the way it has? So in the Swedish bank case, that's what they're asking. Why have we ended up in this fortunate situation in the last recession of having, much lower losses on our corporate loans than other banks? They wanted to know why this had happened. And we're willing to, that was a question, that was a debate. They wanted to use it in a wider debate, but it was also real for them, because if their structure wasn't particularly valuable, then they could easily switch it. Were they going to make major organisational changes? And again, the models are only part of the input into all of these things, in big corporate questions. But that's one thing you might want to ask. This is the most single frequent use. What happens if? What happens if we got the model, we try to articulate the model to give a broad overview of how the industry or the company looks like, and then we can say, what happens if things are different, the counterfactuals. And this is something that people find really valuable in terms of the use of the models. They get a lot of value, not just about the model, but the model often serves as an important catalyst for discussions amongst decision makers within regulators or companies. It helps them articulate and see, yes, this is how we think, come on to this point in a minute, this particular company or industry behaves, and let's think about what might happen if we actually change things, or what happens if, say, the water regulator changes its system of penalties and rewards for missing quality targets, or whatever. So this is a very important use. Or importantly, a theme on this in many industries, how do we persuade the regulator? Which is important because, it's a serious point. I mentioned the water ones. Many regulators are stuffed full with economists who have one view about how the world works, and people on the ground know that's not true. That's not how industries operate. So alternatives there. So these are all practical questions to which practical answers are needed. And importantly, and again it's an obvious point, there are time and resource constraints. So if you've got to make your submission to, which is the case, if you've got to make your submission to the regulator, water regulator, at the end of September this year, then you want your model delivering at least by now, which is done. You don't want it on the 1st of October. There's absolutely no value to it at all. This is, again, an obvious point. So the process, and this is an important point, that to varying degrees, the basis of the model is domain-specific knowledge from the client. So a key feature of building these models is to actually discuss with people in companies who are able to articulate how they think the company or the industry actually operates at quite an abstract level. Now this, in a sense, puts constraints on the abilities to build these models because not everybody can do this. And it also has to be done, in our experience, at a pretty high level within a company for people to have the experience and the ability to see the strategic picture. So there's no point in going to technical people within the company, computer scientists, economists, or whatever. There's no point in going to them because they have narrow technical functions, which are perfectly useful, but they have narrow technical functions. It has to be people who are capable of actually understanding the industry or the company or the problem at a wider strategic level, and to discuss with them and extract from them how they see this particular system operating. And then, in a sense, what we're doing is formalising how they think this actually operates. And this is absolutely key to the process. Now, This is where the time constraints really come in, that these individuals, by definition, face serious time constraints. Now, they're not as bad as Bill Gates, I just read the other day. Even senior Microsoft staff, if they want to get an appointment with Bill Gates, if they book it 3 months in advance, they can get 15 minutes. So I mean, it's not as bad as that. But I mean, if you're at the board or just below the board level, then your diary is full. If you're a practical business person or regulator or what a policymaker, your diary is jam-packed. That's just how the world is. So getting time from these people is actually quite difficult, and they haven't got a lot of it. So one of the things I draw from this is this points to quite high-level parsimonious models. We may be, and I know there's in terms of a research agenda, an academic research agenda, there's an important debate about whether we should be trying to, have the detail of our models, and there's important methodological discussions, very interesting methodological discussions. And I'm not insisting on this point here, although I actually, as it happens, I'm methodologically sympathetic to it, but leaving that aside, in terms of building practical models, you won't have the time in general to extract enough to see these people, to get enough information out of them to start building very detailed models. At least in the first instance, if you strike up a relationship with them over a period of time, then of course, yes, you may be able to do that. So what do we need to do? It's simple. We need to specify the agents in the model. Who are the agents? Now, you may think it's a simple question, but we have to decide who's going to be in the model and who's not. Who's actually going to? What are they going to decide? What decisions can these agents take? Because we might, for simplification purposes, leave out some things that they actually do, and say for these purposes we can assume that they don't do that. We'll focus on some specific aspects of what they do. How do they decide it? That's the key. What's their behavioural rules? And in many of them, who are they connected to if there's a network element to the model? So that's the information that we need to extract. And in terms of validating the models, I mentioned just briefly on the British Telecom one, there's a wider literature. We know more information. We have wider information about evolution of industries in terms of firm entry and firm death. That's a way of validating it. So we're looking for things like that all the time. Ways of validating them which are completely external to the immediate problem at hand. But in general, it sort of partly links into the last talk, that the results are not validated in general by statistical tests. They're generated by the plausibility of the results to the client. So if you build a model of the water industry, and you go to water companies and the water regulator and say, this is how we think the system works, and if they say, no, it doesn't, then that model is no good. Even if scientifically it were true, it's of no use because they don't believe it. So the validation, it's not, so you try and bring in whenever you can, wider information, but this is a key way in a practical context because it means they've got confidence in it. So ideally what you want are most results to be expected. That gives them confidence. They believe, yes, I know that, yes. And then ideally, you can't always guarantee this, a few which are not. They say, oh, yes, that's really interesting. That's good. It means you get more work if you can do that. But sometimes you can't get that. But so this is an important point. So it's not scientific. It's not statistical validation. It's simply validation on the grounds that it's plausible so people actually operate these things. So I think these are some general comments, some just briefly a range of examples and some general points on reflection from having built quite a number of these models over the last few years. Maybe I should just, I say it doesn't mean, also the model may often face external scrutiny, especially if you're involved in any discussion with a regulatory process. The regulators, economists, or other people may want to scrutinise it, or politicians, policymakers in government. So it's got to have scientific merits as well. You've got to be satisfied yourself that the model bears scrutiny. That you could, if necessary, send it to JAS. You might not get accepted, but you could. You think it's a runner on a scientific basis. You've got to be able to do that. But actually, in general, the client is not interested in this. the client assumes that you can do that. Once they've commissioned you to do it, once they believe you can, they're not interested in the technical scientific details. They just assume that, well, some might be, but in general, that's not a high priority. They want their question answered. That's what they're interested in. And they just want your assurance that you've done it properly. And this is up to you to do it. So the things which would interest many of us when we're actually doing a model for publication, saying jazz, we'll try and get this into jazz, which is this. But the client isn't interested. So if you go along with reams and reams of technical analysis, their eyes will glaze over. I mean, they're interested in how it actually operates. Let me, I'm going to perhaps skip through this as there's quite a lot of detail here, but just to give a flavour of a model, we did a model for the National Health Service about elective surgery. This means surgery you don't need, it's not life-threatening. You need a hip replacement or something. So there's a lot of it. Elective surgery in the National Health Service, which I think illustrates the level of simplification we have to make. And also is an illustration at the end of how we actually validate it in practice. So the client was obviously actively involved. Until a few years ago, it was essentially centrally planned. You have your operation, if you want your hip replaced, say, or whatever, you go to the hospital nearest to you. So it was a centrally planned system. But it's gradually been brought in the idea that people may want a choice and say, I may want not to go to the hospital down the road, I may want to go somewhere else. It's a revolutionary idea in the national health. It is. So what happens if, this is before they brought the changes in a few years ago, what happens if consumers can choose where they go? So we've got some decision rules for consumers and providers. We've got to think about that. I mean, how do consumers choose? How do hospitals respond? What can hospitals decide to do? An important part just from the outset, because we know we're talking about health here, health economics, we know in general, health economists are much more realistic in general than many economists. They know that agents are heterogeneous. They know that they operate with imperfect information. They know they're often myopic, and they know they don't necessarily maximize. Health is difficult to understand. So these are features we have to build in. We know that from the external, from general work in health economics. That's an important principle in the model. So our agents are not fully rational. So who does what? So there are consumers and producers. Now the NHS plays a role, the National Health Service plays a role, but for simplification purposes here, we just say all this does is allocate an amount of money for each operation, which the hospital gets if the consumer goes there. That's its sole function. And we bound the model. We're not interested in on the finances on the NHS or whether they can afford it. We just say, yes, they simply provide money. And that's a simplification. We're just interested in the evolution of hospitals. So we could extend the model and start thinking about aspects of that. So now we say consumers, the agents who are consumers, decide which hospitals go through for operation. Now, in general, this is not true because you'll go to a doctor who you may or may not treat as an authority figure, and the doctor says, I think you should just go here. So in practice, for many people, their doctor will take the decision on their behalf, or will at least edit their choice and say, well, okay, there's 100 hospitals you could go to, these 3 might be better for you. And, so the doctor will often edit the choice. So we could build in individuals, doctors, hospitals, but for simplicity, let's just assume that the consumers themselves decide, and we don't lose anything from this. We could have a sort of we could complicate the model there, and it would be an important extension. But just for these purposes, we just leave out, or we could assume it's the doctors deciding on the consumer's behalf. So we just leave out one tier of the decision-making process. Just say it's the consumers deciding which provider to use. Now, what do hospitals decide? Again, what is it they make? We got to say, what do they do? Right. So they can decide whether to invest money in effort to try and make a thing more efficient, get their costs down, cost per operation down. They can invest in quality, and they can invest in capacity. So these are decisions that hospitals go say, what is it that agents can decide? So consumers can obviously decide where to go, depending on their utility functions. But hospitals decide three things: whether they can, if they've got some money, do they try and make them so? Do they try and get the cost per operation down? Do they invest in quality, or do they invest in capacity? And again, this is through discussions with people in the health service. But there are also potential new entrants who might enter the market if a hospital fails. There are no network effects in this particular model, though we could introduce them. So how do we introduce, so consumers, how do we introduce a complex range of factors which relate to the ability and propensity of different social groups to gather information and to exercise choice based on this information? Because we're not meant to be blunt. I mean, if you're people from poor areas in general, can't understand the stuff, don't gather the information, and would just say, okay, I'll go to my local hospital. That's where people have always gone. Whereas the more affluent areas, there may be more interest in making this choice as a broader. So this is a very complex problem. So we make a dramatic simplification that the model does have spatial structure, the number of regions in the model. But every consumer in a given area is assumed to live at the same location, so we don't attempt to measure actual locations initially. So here's a region, they all live here, so we can get a measure of distance to the hospitals. So we just say, well, there's inertia. We build an inertia factor. We don't try and say which areas are poor and which areas are rich initially. I'll get an example at the end where we did this. And so we just say, well, there'll be a propensity just to say, regardless of my utility function, I'll just go to the local hospital. So there's some probability. So when a consumer comes to choose, all right, it's your turn to have your operation, where do you want to go? So if you're in a poor area, all the agents in this area say there's a high probability, you'll just say, I'll go to the local one. If you're in a richer area, lower probability, and then your choice is exercised. So you're given a given area with a probability drawn from a uniform distribution. Now, if we have more information, when we get a particular example, I'll just show one briefly right at the end, we can bring more information and calibrate this much more closely. We can start bringing in different features. But let's just start off with a very general model of that. So the parameters is common to all consumers, so we don't try and differentiate between consumers in a given area. But again, that's more detail we could add to the model. We're just thinking, what is the basic framework to actually analyse this question? What happens if these markets opened up to competition? How does consumer welfare increase or decline as a result of this? Which is a big policy question. I mean, in health terms in Britain, many of the professionals involved in the health service now are actively opposed to competition, actively opposed to it. So it's an important policy issue. So if they don't choose a local one automatically, they examine their utility functions. These may still lead the local one to be selected. So it depends upon the quality of the hospital, what they perceive it to be, which they perceive imperfectly, but there's information on this, the wait time, and the distance to the hospital. We all scale this in 0 and 1. So we have different types of consumers. Now, somewhat to our surprise, the Department of Health actually had some stated preference research about what consumers wanted. I was dumbfounded when they said they'd got this information. But they had, and they identified 4 types with different weights on the 3 factors. Now, obviously, one feature will be as a market starts to evolve, as choice does come in, then consumer preferences may evolve in response to this. And so these fixed weights on the different features here may not be fixed. So that's a potential addition to the model. That's another simplification we're making to say initially, let's just assume that these preferences, these 4 types of preferences hold. So we make a simplification there. There are thresholds beyond which no one will choose a hospital. That's interesting. So that's the details of the utility functions. Now, what do the producers do? So they differ in the quality, efficiency, the number of consumers they treat, and their capacity. We have some starting off rules. What they can decide is, this is one thing we left out. The Department of Health economists, people wanted to make a distinction between efficiency and effort, which I never really quite understood. But the key thing is they can try and keep their costs down by making more effort. they described that as effort rather than efficiency, which I found very confusing, but that's how they described it. So they can make effort to keep their costs down. They receive a fixed amount of money for each consumer treated. We just set that equal to 1. Now, obviously, that's not true. It will vary depending on the type of operation. But let's just, again, put this in for simplicity. They specify a very general cost function, which they thought was, okay, what's the cost function for hospitals look like? One is a complicated expression involving quality, effort, and the number of operations. Obviously, it increases with all these 3. The other part is the capacity of hospital multiplied by a random number. It's a measure of the efficiency of the hospital. So just moving forward. So the 3 types of producers. And so we had to be very careful about the names we gave to these. So they said, okay, there are ones which try their easy life. And this does characterize many of the hospitals. They try to minimize the effort. You know, they're not very interested in becoming efficient. They're not very interested in getting more patients, but they want to survive. They want to keep their jobs. So, you know, as long as they break even, they don't care. And this, to anybody who's actually been involved with the NHS, will be immediately recognisable as big chunks of the system. This seems to be a reasonable description of motivation. And in fact, if they make a profit in a year, I thought it's quite amusing, if they make a profit in a year by chance, they just slacken off and do less the next year. But this was thought to be a reasonable description. You can see these are very sensitive descriptions. I'm not going to, I've got too much detail here, sorry Sam. And they predict the number of consumers using a simple extrapolation based on the change of it. So they don't try and do any sophisticated forecasts, and they want an easy life. So they think, how many we're going to get next year? We know we have to adjust our capacity, and that's what we'll do. You know, we think we're going to get 10% more, 10% less. Let's, you know, close a few beds, invest a bit more. But we just want an easy life. Now, the other ones, they're not for profit. And they do try and maximise a rather complicated expression based on the number of operations, the quality, and the effort. So these are really trying to offer a service. Now, they do want to get more customers. They do want to improve their quality. They do want to get their costs down, but they are traditional in the sense that they're not driven by a profit motive. They want to maximise the number of serve and the quality and reduce effort. And the final ones, the ones who enter, all the initial hospitals are these 2 types. We want an easy life, or if you like, they're sort of good co-ops. They want to, you know, they're not for profit, but they want to produce a good service. And we say, okay, the ones who come in are profit maximisers. If a gap opens up, they're only interested in doing it because they want to make a profit out of the system. So all we need to know is there are these 3 types of producers. And essentially, because I'm conscious I've got too much detail in here, so we can start the model off. Here's an important rule. A hospital is deemed to exit the market if it incurs a cumulative loss of L% of total cost in any given year, which initially was assumed to be 8%. So we've got an exit rule. If you lose too much money, you go out of the market. An important what-if question was, what happens if this number's much bigger? What happens if the National Health are willing to continue to underwrite you for longer? Does this make a qualitative difference to the nature of the outcomes? That's a what-if question. And we got all sorts of wait times, solutions. So here's a summary of results. The agents are all myopic. They use simple forecasting rules. They exhibit inertia. They have imperfect information. And some producers are captured by producer interests in their motivations. So does opening the market to competition work? Does it improve consumer welfare? Even making these quite strict, non-neoclassical assumptions. But still, in general, in this model, average quality improves, average wait time falls, and consumer utility increases, even though we've made these realistic assumptions about behaviours of producers and behaviours of consumers. We still get these results coming out. And so just to describe, here's improvement in average quality, the change in average waiting times, normally falling. These are negative numbers. We can get some solutions when wait time increases on average. And in general utility, we measure utility, just add it up again. In general utility increases, we can get some solutions when utility falls. Now it's quite interesting because at the same time, some people in Chicago, entirely unknown to us, have built a very similar model of introducing choice into the Chicago primary school system. So we can identify the circumstances in which we might get an increase in waiting time of having competition. We might get consumer utility falling. And everything that I've said up to now about the model, in general, apart from the people we're directly involved with, was of no interest to, not really of any interest to anybody. They're interested in this. That's what they want to know. If we open it up, if we make realistic assumptions, what's the outcome? Are people going to be better off or not? Are we going to get a lot of complaints if we bring competition in? What's the outcome going to be? And this is what they're interested in. But interestingly, we find actually, paradoxically, the bigger the weight that consumers give to quality, the more likely you are to get an adverse outcome. Because in the limit, supposing all consumers say, I'll go to the best hospital. Now, they may perceive it imperfect, but leaving that aside. So everybody says, right, I want to go there, to the best one. And so their waiting list becomes enormous, and the other hospitals have no customers, and so go out of business. I mean, that's slightly, there's a bit of inertia in it, so it doesn't happen completely like that. But paradoxically, the more consumers, the more rational consumers are, if you like, in terms of, yes, I want to go to a place where I can get the best treatment, the more likely it is that opening it up to competition will make people worse off. We can do further analysis. I'm just going to finish on this. So how we actually calibrated it. Because we have, here is, be familiar to British people, a map of Birmingham, a city in the centre of England, one of the biggest cities in, after second or third biggest after London. And here are the actual hospitals in that area where they're located. And the real validation was we actually got some real data, not immense detail, which described the characteristics of these individual hospitals, some characteristics of their immediate catchment areas. And then I'd been making some rather general assumptions with sort of random draws and making probabilities and so forth. Then we can actually narrow it down with some real information. We're not interested in the tremendous detail, but we can actually input into the model. We can narrow those down and calibrate it with real information. And we did that and presented it to a group of people from these hospitals who'd never seen this model before. And one of the things, for example, we put in is to say, this is one of the results, and say, run the model 1,000 times. These are actually existing hospitals. They really exist. And say, what with the probability of a hospital being forced out of business through opening up to competition? And we had ones which seemed pretty safe. And these are some examples of hospitals with a low probability of exit. And there are 3 real hospitals. We said in general, if you open to competition, they will probably survive. But the best thing, we had one hospital which we said there's an 88% chance that this will go out of business. And they all burst out laughing. He said, yes, we know all about that one. It's just useless. So I thought that was a really good validation of the model. I mean, it's just an example. Sorry, I've put too much detail in this. I talked for a bit too long on the opening things. But this is an actual example where it's trying to capture some realistic features, right? I mean, the people in the health service have to recognise producer behaviour. You know, yes, we think this is what producers do. We think this is a realistic description of motivations. They have to recognise consumers. This is a way consumers might choose. They know that there's a lot of inertia in the system. They know they're myopic. So it's got to feel realistic to them. So there's an element of, if you like, real data in that. But there's also an element, as you can see, of abstraction, where in the general model, we're not necessarily looking for specific detail. We're building the general model, first of all, where we may assume, say, a random draw and a uniform distribution in a number of cases to get the model working and generate the results. And then once you've got to that stage, you're able then to go into specifics and start to calibrate it more closely on real data. So it's illustrating, we extract information from the client, which gives it credibility, and I say our validation is that we present it to these clients and say, this is what we think about what will happen to these hospitals, what's the percentage chance? And they say, yes, we believe that. So having said that, that gives us more confidence in the overall properties of the model, because professionals on the ground who hadn't been involved with the model at all felt its results were reasonable on specific hospitals that they knew specific information about, much more detailed information than we did. And that's what I mean by having the people within the industry or the company validate the model and say, this seems plausible to us. It doesn't mean they necessarily agreed, they've probably not thought of it this way, that Sandwell General had a 17% chance of exit, but they probably know, yeah, it's a pretty good hospital, the staff are pretty good, they're trying to do good things, they're trying to expand, they're trying to provide quality, so it seems reasonable to us that they'll probably be okay. But they're not perfect, so there's a chance that they'll go under. So this is an illustration of validation. So that's it. I'm just trying to give examples of flavours, how you go about it, and what the key issues are in terms of building models that people will sign checks for. Thanks.